Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. The first one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsco.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the podcast. With me today, I have Professor Dennis Turish. Hi, Dennis.
Hiya, Adrian.
Who is Professor of Leadership and Organisation, I think that's right, at Sussex Business School, which is within the University of Sussex, which is just down the road from me, so it's super convenient. And one of the first times I've been doing a face-to-face chat, as it were, using some new kit, which is like lanyard, kind of like mics and stuff. And we think it's going to work. But anyway, enough about the equipment. Dennis, hello, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great, Adrian. It's really nice to have the chance to talk to you about some of these issues I know we both care about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So for the benefit of our listeners and kind of readers of some of the show notes and things, Dennis, can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on you and your background and the work that you do?
Well, I come originally from Northern Ireland, which helped to inform, in my case, a very strong interest in dysfunctional leadership. Because we had so many of them around the place. And
also the times of the Troubles and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, precisely. And we ended up trying to solve the problem by giving them power and putting them into government, which is fair enough. So I've always had this interest in leadership, good and bad, and what distinguishes them. I've had an interest in organisations that you might describe as cults, where dysfunctional leadership is taken to an extreme. And again, that was powered by personal experiences growing up in a very troubled society. And more recently, I've developed an interest in the quality of management research and an increasing concern about the issues that it tends to ignore, which tend to be the big issues. It doesn't really say much about very important things. It's more because academics these days we're incentivized and we're rewarded for producing lots of studies about relatively small topics that can appear in leading journals, and we therefore ignore the really big questions that are hard to answer.
And before we get into that, what do you think the big questions are? Are we talking about big issues around like sustainability and inequality and all of those different sort of things?
Well, those issues, yes. But for example, leading management journals have published virtually nothing on the Great Recession of 2008.
Right.
Just the other day, I went through the Academy of Management Journal, which is one of the flagship journals of the management academic profession. Mm-hmm. They have published precisely 0 articles on the financial crisis 12 years ago, which is astonishing and disgraceful. And they have published maybe a total of 5 articles that deal in some way with climate change,
right,
which of course is the big existential crisis that we face
right.
as a species. So there's something wrong with our scholarship, I think, when what are obviously really critical issues merit so little attention.
And why is that? Do you think it's because they have no clue, or they're just they don't know how to tackle it, or it's just not on vogue, as it were? Or
there are a couple of reasons that I think drive it, and both of them are quite harmful. One is that academic research is now assessed and audited in lots of different ways. And here, certainly in the UK, the big way that's done is through what we call the Research Excellence Framework, mm-hmm. which means you produce a certain number of papers within a tight time frame, and these are then assessed for quality. Now, the problem about addressing the really big issues is that they might not lead to quick publication in these journals.
Right.
You certainly don't know the answer before you start.
Okay.
And they might be very complicated to address with a certain prospect of failure at the end of it. So that's a disincentive.
So is that like a measures and targets sort of kind of problem?
It is a measures and targets kind of problem. And Goodhart's law, as it's called, applies that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Yeah.
The other problem related to that is that our so-called leading journals, they evaluate the publications that are submitted to them overwhelmingly on the basis of one criteria, and that is whether the paper develops theory in some way. Now, I have nothing against developing theory, but I do have something against the idea that every paper must do so. And again, I think that can overwhelm the inclination that we have to address really important issues.
And does that mean that what you end up doing is that it's because I sometimes read some of these academic papers, and it feels like an exercise in obfuscation, sort of thing, if that's the right pronunciation of that word.
Yeah, it is an exercise in obfuscation. And I recently published a book, Management Studies in Crisis, which has a chapter that deals with exactly that. The writing is absolutely atrocious because people are told, well, you must develop theory. Now, that's actually quite difficult to do.
Yes.
And therefore, one way of engaging with that pressure is to pretend to be developing theory by using language that nobody can really understand. Exactly. And as a social scientist, Michael Billig, I think, wrote a number of years ago, sometimes big words are used not to convey a discovery, but to cover up its absence.
Well,
and I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, so I think about, so it's like the developing theory, but then I know that we were talking before, and you were talking about wanting to rebalance it rather than actually everybody being in search of the answer or advancing theory. In other words, it's almost a bit like we need to make it okay just to want to go and understand a problem, to identify it, and you go, we're just going to go and have a look and see what we find. And in no way of thinking about we're going to solve it, we're just going and understand it, because actually the process of investigation and understanding is actually a service in of itself.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying we should not develop theory.
No, not at all.
I'm just saying that there are other things we can also do and sometimes do in place of that. So the first step is to really just say simply, well, what's going on here? And find a way of describing that.
Yeah.
But the pressure to develop theory means that sometimes we force fit data and a description of a problem into an existing theoretical framework that might not actually apply very well. And it hinders the description of interesting problems and phenomenon that we should be engaging with.
And so if I think about because a lot of the, I think what we've seen over recent kind of years is we've seen the development of kind of like I feel like management as a more of a popular genre, as it were, particularly as it's extended from academia into sort of business publishing, and then to the professionalization of management, let's say. But what you're talking about, that has implications of the things that follow downstream, because you end up with academics doing research that some of the time then turns into books. Then it gets propounded and turned into kind of like these big theories, and then we talk about cults or movements and things. But actually, you're also going to turn around in some of your papers saying, like, actually a lot of this can't really be backed up or replicated in things. So
a lot of it can't be backed up.
So does that mean that we should take some of the stuff that gets published and the kind of the big ballyhoos that go with it and the jamborees and things with a pinch of salt, or what's the implication of all this?
Well, first of all, I think most managers don't actually read management journals. I was speaking at an event yesterday in London. I think there was maybe 50 people there, most of them non-academics, and not one of them on a regular basis read management journals.
Would you put kind of something like HBR as a management journal, or is that
it's more of a magazine that doesn't publish primary research?
Okay.
But it can have its uses. But unfortunately, those people who don't read management journals aren't missing anything, because the content is written for other management academics rather than the world of practice out there. Although I think that we should broaden their purpose to say, we should write in such a way that other people can understand what we do and find something of interest in it. Not just practicing managers, by the way, because what organisations do affects us all. So I think we should, think about our potential audiences, for example, NGOs, trade unions, politicians, the general public and the like. But most of what we write at the moment isn't read by anybody. Probably not even the mothers of the people who write the papers concerned. It's very hard to be interested in them.
Yeah, but it also kind of like it surely has implications on education and stuff, because the research will form the education, and then if so much of the research is quite esoteric or can't really be supported or replicated, as it were, and that feeds into the education of students, you're like going, it's kind of like they're always getting educated in stuff that doesn't work. In many ways. I mean, it's a funny cycle sort of thing that almost feels like academia needs to get more connected with the organisation of work, like you say, maybe with trade unions or with kind of like workers' bodies or management councils or actual organisations themselves, so actually kind of to help them through their research expertise to better understand some of the problems that they're facing.
Yeah, I think ideas have consequences, however indirectly they're communicated to or directly they're communicated to people. And there is a school of thought that if you look at some of the big corporate scandals that have come out in the last number of years, or even the Great Recession, in some shape or form, many business schools were complicit in that. Finance research, for example, was complicit in developing various models that led to collateralized debt obligations and the like, on the basis of theoretical assumptions that said there was really virtually no risk that was involved here. Now, that wasn't by itself the only thing that played a part, because if people weren't receptive to it, it would have had no impact. But it did have an impact. And very many of the people in charge of, for example, Enron, they had done MBAs at the leading business schools in the United States. I encountered
some of those in kind of like previous life.
Yeah, and the general pushing of this idea that the primary measure of your performance was shareholder value, which business schools were very much complicit in. Various other ideas.
And still are.
And still are, exactly. Well, I think that has had an effect on the practice of leading managers for the worse. And it would be very good if we could reorientate a little bit towards real problems, real issues, and other priorities. And
you talk about the big issues and things, and you talk about that those kind of real kind of problems. I mean, are you seeing? I mean, I see in the business community, and that's been driven by a number of different things, kind of consumer pressure, environmental kind of like concerns. There's this reevaluation around: is it just all about total shareholder return? And it's all about profits, and a reevaluation. Right, we need to have we need to be addressing multiple stakeholders, and I think it's almost a reemergence of the triple bottom line. But is that being followed, and that sort of idea, is it being picked up in academia? That people kind of starting to kind of
Yes, I think there is growing concern about the state of the field, and that's expressed in different ways. More of our leading journals are publishing material saying, what on earth are we doing, and why aren't we doing more work that actually matters,
right?
And that people will be interested and read. So some of our top journals have said we want to include more material that addresses these grand challenges. And then we have the development of things like, for example, the Responsible Research in Business and Management Network, which a number of leading academics in the US have launched, and which a number of institutions and individuals, including myself, are now affiliated to it. So that's doing a great deal of work to raise awareness of these issues and try and create a bit of a different culture. You see, nobody becomes a management academic to write rubbish or to address trivial issues as their primary purpose. They're kind of pushed into it by the examples of their peers and by the pressures of these audit systems under which we labour. And I think I am campaigning now to try and get as many of us as possible to go a little bit beyond that.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, and I think that's, it's like in many situations we go in as idealists and then kind of get beaten up by the system.
But there is more and more unhappiness about it. I have a paper coming out this month in Academy of Management, Learning and Education, which is adapted from my book, and it's called The Triumph of Nonsense in Management Studies. Now, that did provoke, when it came online in advance of publication in the journal, something unusual happened. Normally you publish an academic paper and you don't hear another word about it. Well, in this case I got over 40 emails from academics all around the world using my paper as the launch pad to express their own
He said, therefore I can say.
Yeah, their
Sure.
own enormous dissatisfaction with the current practices that we all face. Now that's encouraging, and we just need to maintain that open discussion of the fact that Houston, we have a problem.
Yeah, and I think when we were talking before, I think one of those kind of like problems about this publication of nonsense and the search for theory and all of these different sort of things. You talked about leadership cults and stuff, and particularly about leadership. You had a lot to say about transformational and versus like this the new I would call it sort of like a renamed or rebadged kind of authentic leadership, and how. Well, I'm not going to I'll tee you up on that. So tell me what you think. I mean, does it feels like a cult? It feels like almost a bit like going, we're always going to rely on a hero. Yes. You know, somebody's going to save us, as it were. Yeah. And but it doesn't really stack up, or doesn't really stack up against scrutiny.
No, I don't think it stacks up at all. I think it is. I think both transformational and so-called authentic leadership theory, which in my view is just a rebranding of transformational leadership with some of the caffeine taken out, but it's still fundamentally the same product. Essentially, they encourage this worship, particularly of CEOs. Yeah. As the only or the dominant change agent.
Well, it becomes the cult of the leader, right?
It encourages dependency on the part of the followers. It also then encourages the leader to accumulate more and more power to the centre in the mistaken belief that they have to know everything, decide everything, control everything, take full responsibility for organisational success or failure. I don't think it works. I think the world is too complex for that to happen. And you then look at the literature on these topics and you just see this bewildering and ever-extending list of things that these leaders are supposed to do. Moral agents, empathetic, work-life balance. They're supposed to model something that even St. Peter would be very hard pushed to demonstrate in front of us.
I think I
don't think that works.
I think the fascinating thing about the rebranding of transformational leadership to authentic leadership is the appropriation of the word authentic that to mean everything that's positive and good in the world, where actually you could be a complete shit to somebody consistently, and that would be authentic leadership.
Yeah. Well, look at Harvey Weinstein, for example, who had enormous organisational power. He was an authentic individual. He was an authentic bastard. He was not in the least bit troubled by any of the bad things that he did.
Sure.
So that's kind of troublesome for the theory of authentic leadership, which claims that authentic leaders only display a bewildering list of very good qualities. And the other problem with that theory, of course, is that none of us can be, or even should be, totally authentic all the time. Like if you're married to someone, you don't always tell them every thought that you have in your head about them or your relationship. You would be divorced if you did. And leaders are in the same position.
Sure.
And academics are too. When I go in to see my students in the morning, irrespective of how I'm feeling, I can't go in and lay my problems on them and tell them how depressed I am about something or other. I have to be enthusiastic and stir them up. Leaders are in the same position. So there's the reason why it's gained credence, in my view, is that many of the people who have developed these theories simply develop them so that they can become consultants for corporations. And it can be very appealing to a CEO to say, you are the most important individual in the room. And by doing what I tell you to do, you can become even more effective, more powerful, and of course, better remunerated.
And do you think that kind of like plays into that it makes me think that that's possibly one of the reasons why, so it's like a cult of leadership, like it's also a celebrity culture in many ways, the celebrity of the CEO. And do you think that's probably one of the reasons why ideas like servant leadership it's been around for a while, but hasn't become necessarily as popular as it might do because it doesn't work on that kind of like celebrity cult sort of like status?
Yeah, it does.
Because it has humility and a respectfulness, right? And it's kind of like very hard, and it's like, I'm not going to save you sort of thing. I'm going to help us work together so we can save each other sort of thing.
Yeah, I know, and I mean, if you think about what happens when you acquire more power within an organisation, well, first of all, some empirical studies show that when you get more power in an organisation, you become less inclined to ask anybody for advice, and less inclined to take that advice when it is offered, even though arguably that's when you most need it. Now, you translate that into somebody who has become a CEO, who has absolutely enormous power, and people increasingly find it difficult to talk to such people and tell them what they really think. Rather, they tell the CEO what they believe the CEO wants to hear.
Sure.
So I think it's possible to become like a rock star with a sycophantic entourage, and that minimises the willingness of these people to actually really give power away. And it's not just a personal feeling, it's an institutional one. I mean, the fact is that shareholders in the form of pension funds and the like demand short-term results from this individual focused on shareholder value. So a CEO probably feels that they've got a blowtorch held to their feet all the time, demanding miracles and impossible standards of performance. That militates against the idea that, well, you should just go around for a while and ask other people what they think should be done.
Yeah, just be a normal person and go around and speak to people.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. You know, many I did some research recently on hubris in the banking and finance sector.
Right.
And that was interesting from the point of view of how leading individuals within the sector behave and see themselves. For example, one woman talked to me about her female CEO in a finance company whom she knew quite well. She met this lady in the checkout queue at Marks and Spencer's one day and passed the time of day with her. The following day, her line manager brought her in and reprimanded her for speaking to the CEO in public. Now, that type of thing shows that there's an ego out of control, and narcissism and hubris can result, and neither narcissism or hubris are conducive to good decision making.
But I think that's also kind of like, I also think that if you think about the nature of the world and the nature of kind of markets and pressures and organisations kind of these days, and what feels like we're moving away from being a predominantly kind of command and control structured kind of organizational kind of ecosystem into something or people are trying to move to things that are a bit more responsive and adaptive with a flatter hierarchy and so on and so forth. But it feels like that the kind of the reliance or kind of desire to kind of put in place this transformational kind of authentic leadership, hero leader in place with a more responsive, adaptable organisation, a flatter organisation, they're sort of like out of step with each other.
Well, they absolutely are out of step, and I'm not sure I buy this idea that we're moving towards some kind of post-bureaucratic, flatter state of organisations. People have been talking about this movement in that direction for at least the last 20 years.
It's not going to happen.
Well, in some sectors and in some organisations it is happening, but it's paralleled in other organisations with, if anything, a growth in distrust and surveillance.
Well, yeah, because we were talking about this before you came up with this. I wanted to get this on tape, as it were. I said in inverted commas, and it was like we were talking about the flatter organisations imbuing kind of like your employees with more trust and responsibility, and wanting them to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, and so on and so forth. And yet we have these advent of new technologies that are coming to the organisation, which are basically surveilling the heck out of everything and everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you coined it, and I was just like going, I'm not sure that goes against the sort of trust. It goes against the trust and the freedom sort of thing. And you said the rise of Stalinism in the modern organisation. I'm like going, brilliant. I have to get that recorded.
Well, it's a historical irony that the last redoubt of Stalinism in the modern world is the modern corporation.
Yeah.
In a way, it's this illusion of control that you can absolutely control what 100,000 other people do, whereas you can only really control yourself. And yet the technology is emerging that enables people to engage precisely in surveillance. For example, I was reading recently that some surveillance equipment was installed onto the desks of Daily Telegraph journalists without their knowledge, but it enabled the system and managers to record when they were at their desks and when they were away from their desks. That's potentially frightening, of course, and the unintended consequences of it are enormous, because that can only reduce intrinsic motivation, which is so central for creativity
and engagement and everything else.
And ultimately it takes away from people's own desire to do the job well for its own sake. But these old ideas about leadership that are still quite influential encourage people to adopt that kind of approach, Because ultimately it's part of, well, agency theory that business schools have also developed, this idea that unless people are tightly controlled, they will shirk their responsibilities and not do their jobs. So therefore we must monitor them and monitor them and monitor them. And I think it's dangerous, actually, from many points of view, and it ultimately can only lead to corrupt organisations, because what you will have is an elite that can monitor everybody else, but is itself outside anybody else's control.
Sounds like modern society.
It does a bit. I'm thinking about organisations like Theranos,
Right.
that some people might have heard about.
And it's recently collapsed.
Collapsed, yeah. It was this fantastic startup set up by a young woman called Elizabeth Holmes. She managed to get people like Henry Kissinger on her board, and she was declared the youngest female billionaire in US corporate history. Now her trial for fraud is starting this year, so that tells you what ultimately happened. But if you look at how her company was organised, it was all built around the principles of surveillance, cameras everywhere, restrictions on internal email communications between departments, people having to sign in and out electronically when they move from one part of the building to the other. Holmes and her key aides so positioned within the building that they could themselves physically see when everybody came into work and when everybody left for work, of course with a long hours culture as part of that. And that was a way of concentrating power in her hands and her main business partner, who at that time she was romantically engaged with. It didn't end well, and I don't think there are many precedents actually for totalitarian regimes having a benevolent leader at the helm. And it's an enormous I mean, if you aren't crazy when you become a totalitarian leader, you will become one as a result of it.
Yeah.
Because the atmosphere is so ridiculous, with everything delegated up to you to decide, and other people refusing to take decisions because they're afraid of the consequences of making an error. You will go crazy in that environment, and along with you, the organisation will perish and become fragile.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that sort of thing. It's like, and it's we seem to be in that environment. That we have to be careful about the idea of like, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
sometimes I don't think necessarily many of these execs and some of these senior positions in these large organisations, or any organisation for that matter, have malign intents, kind of like with all that. But it's almost like all these things kind of come up. They go, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's interesting. And then they just do these things, and it becomes little things, and then all of a sudden you become this absolute dictator.
Yeah.
And it's like you can almost like fall into it accidentally in many ways. And I think,
but it's also because I think that we start off with certain default assumptions about what the job of a leader and a manager is, and generally that's framed in terms of things like knowing everything, deciding everything, and controlling everything. So if that's your mindset approaching the job, no wonder you're going to make full use of all these techniques for surveillance and the like, without being fully enough aware of the unintended consequences that flow from that. And I think you can either control people to death, or you can have people innovating and making positive steps in their own mind and in their own work behaviour, but you cannot have both. That's the paradox.
And so if you were to give some advice to, either current leaders or aspirant kind of leaders, or and future leaders, what would it be? Would it be like kind of examining your assumptions and be honest about them? I mean, properly honest about them?
Yeah, although that is difficult, isn't it? Because our assumptions become ingrained and we think that they're the natural way of the world. But I think we need leaders to just have a root and branch rethink of what the job actually consists of.
Right.
And I would say that one of the things that a leader should aim to do is they should maybe just count up the number of decisions they make in a day and reduce them.
Right.
Because they need to embed that decision-making authority at lower levels in the hands of people who are directly addressing the problem. And this starts at the level of students.
Yeah.
For example, I was having a workshop with some students recently. We created a simulation of a leisure centre that was having various problems with customer service and so on. And the challenge for the students was, well, how do you promote more team spirit to engage with these issues? And they came up with loads of ideas. Take them off paintballing, create a trapped room scenario, do X, Y, and Z. But absolutely none of them, and I ran this across about 5 workshops, none of them thought of actually just creating empowered teams and telling them, address the problem. what's happening,
Yeah.
what do we need to do to fix it, and then fix it, take action to do it. It was because they had this assumption that we can have these teams and they will do whatever they're told, and it's the job of the manager in charge of them to fix the problem. It didn't occur to them that the people actually on the ground could themselves fix the problem.
Yeah.
And I found that a little bit alarming, and I do think that mindset can continue when we actually get into real organisations and become harmful.
Completely. I think it's one of those things. It's remarkable how often individuals don't take responsibility for the problem, for owning the problem, or actually thinking about. So it's almost a bit like they're looking externally for, if we do this, like an escape room thing or a paintballing thing, or we'll go and do whitewater rafting or whatever. That's the external sort of kind of like injection of stuff that's going to make kind of magic happen, rather than going, if I'm the manager, then maybe it's to do with kind of me and how I can run.
Precisely. And what all those lovely things don't do is they don't actually change anybody's behaviour in work.
Sure.
And I think the biggest single problem that we have with decision making in work is that we just don't let people make decisions enough on issues with which they are perfectly expert. And that ranges from small things to big things.
I think that starts in our education system.
It does.
Starts at school, is that we're not really encouraged to
make decisions.
To think and then make decisions in many ways. We're almost encouraged to kind of like accumulate stuff and then regurgitate stuff.
But in most organisations you have to go through 3 approval processes to spend £5.
Yeah.
Your discretion is circumscribed all the time. And I often tell students of an experience I had a number of years ago. A colleague and I were hired by an NHS organisation to do a consulting project on improving how it communicated with its publics. They knew that it wasn't good, they wanted to know how to fix it. So they created a project team to work with us, made up of 6 expert people within the NHS Trust, who were able to say, well, you should talk to this person, you should ignore that, and you should gather a focus group from this particular client base, and so on. And we had several very productive meetings with them. We worked out an action plan, and then nothing happened. So after a couple of months, we got back to him and we said, hey, what's happening? And it turned out that unknown to us, this project team couldn't actually authorise us to do anything until they got the approval of what was called a project board. And that was a group of even more senior managers who were in loads of other project boards and were too busy to ever meet as a project board for this particular project. So after another couple of months of nothing, we invoiced them for half our fee, got paid, and the project never happened. Now, I often wonder, what did they think we were all going to do? Set fire to the curtains or something? These were good people who knew exactly what needed to be done, and nothing bad could have come out of it. But because the whole emphasis was on controlling people, taking decision-making power away from them and concentrating it in the hands of a bunch of already very overworked people, what you had was a fragile organisation in which there was a bias towards inaction rather than solving problems. And I think that in most bureaucratic organisations you could have similar experiences multiplied 100-fold.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that in my experience in working with organisations like that, I think there's that problem. But there's also the other kind of problem that I know I've learned from my own experiences, that we make assumptions that if you kind of like enable and empower people, they'll just go off and do wonderful things. And you look at it and go, no. The hard lesson in that is like you're asking people to jump rails and then actually kind of operate on a different sort of track. But in order to do that, you have to help them understand what it means and to run on a different sort of type of track. You can't just kind of go, on you go then, crack on. Now, some people can do that, but the majority of people need a bit of guidance and a bit of learning and a bit of structure to help them build up the confidence to do that sort of stuff.
It's a very difficult balancing act, because sometimes senior managers say to people, you're empowered, but by the way, I want to know on Monday morning what exactly you have done and how far towards the solution to this problem you are. So that probably isn't going to work. But I think there are 2 things that will help drive us in this direction. The one is to improve people's level of training and competence and whatever the issue is. Too often we don't do that. And the second is to really take care to make sure that everybody is clear about what the overall purpose of the organisation actually is. And I've been very struck recently meeting people from different military organisations, including the British Army, how they're attempting to embrace this. In the British Army, they talk about mission command. as an approach where the objective is that the people who will be actually carrying out the mission are in fine detail aware of what the purpose of that mission is, not just what they need to do. And the reason for that, obviously, is first of all to increase their motivation, but secondly, so that whenever new things come up that aren't part of the plan, they can improvise, adapt, and do something that will help to achieve the mission. And I do think that in many organisations, people have this view that what a worker needs to know is only what they need to know to do their job. Now, that, in my opinion, is dangerous and false, and it means that they will not have a sense of that wider purpose. And if you treat people like imbeciles, they become imbeciles, and they keep making demands instead of taking decisions. And we need people to make more decisions, to take more responsibility. And we can only do that if we create the conditions in which that is a routine expectation.
Well, that's it. I mean, I think there's a kind of an idea within like systems thinking, with the idea that most culture programs are a complete waste of time because
they are,
because you need to create the right system conditions, and then people will create their own kind of culture. Precisely. Because the systems conditions will define that or become the bounds for that, or they're not the bounds for it, but they'll kind of you create the environment, and then people will do the work. Particularly if you organise the organisation in the right way to be able to kind of do the right sort of work.
Well, we know from a lot of research that it's very difficult to change attitudes. It's much easier to change behaviours, and then people change attitudes to come in line with those behaviours, and that can absolutely start from the centre and from the top. I mean, I also think that a lot of senior managers, they say we need radical fundamental culture change around here, by which they often mean that everybody else has to change and I can stay the same. That won't work either. It really won't.
No. And so the I guess we've just got to, people have got to get almost like they need to kind of release or kind of relax this kind of idea of control, or but control by another word kind of doesn't make things kind of like better. It's a bit like the transformational authentic kind of leadership sort of thing. Just because you rebadge it doesn't make it kind of any kind of better.
And I worry that we're actually moving in a direction where more attempts at control are being exercised. The software exists to measure more and more and more observable things. So therefore we measure them because we can. I know academic life is suffering from that, and yet ultimately some of the most important things that go on cannot be measured because you cannot see inside people's heads. And you can't actually instruct people to be innovative. It's very difficult. They have to want to do it.
So it was an interesting piece of research. I mean, and I'm going to keep an eye on time, but an interesting piece of research that came out of the University of Darden Business School in the States. It was done by a marketing professor over there, and it was a bit of lateral sort of research. He was interested about in this idea of the quantified self, like Fitbits and kind of iWatches and all that type of stuff. And he was interested in the what impact it had on the person. He had it was like a small study, but it was like two groups. There was like a group that was having all their activity kind of measured, and then there was a control group that weren't. And what he found was that the research group that were having their activity measured, that whatever it was, whether it was physical or steps or heartbeats or whatever, that or it was predominantly physical stuff. He found that whilst the level of activity, the quantity of activity went up, their engagement and level of enjoyment of the activity went down. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking, that's interesting. I wonder if you apply that laterally into an organisation in terms of how we can measure everything. And we worry about quality of output and engagement and productivity and all that sort of stuff. And so it might look like on the surface, because we're measuring everything, everybody is being compelled by the measurement of to do more stuff. But actually, if the engagement with it and the quality of it goes down, then actually the net kind of like on aggregate output is kind of like it's not great. And so I'm wondering if, again, that's the consequence of this kind of the measurement of stuff, is that does that explain maybe some of the engagement sort of kind of issues that we have kind of with work, and the kind of the lack of innovation and creativity and productivity and all that sort of stuff, is because we've almost got all these technological bureaucratic kind of things that's almost like suppressing.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, actually. If I think about what I'm most familiar with, which is the academic environment, the official story is that the quality of research in British higher education has gone through the roof in the last 20 odd years as a result of this research excellence framework. Now, it is true that the volume of stuff produced has certainly gone up. It's also true that by applying the various metrics of the REF, more of it is judged of higher quality. It's also true, in my opinion, that the overall quality of it is actually very low, despite the official metrics. And a large part of the reason for that is that people's minds have been focused on producing stuff for the sake of it, because they have to. Fewer projects are initiated because of the intrinsic interest of them to the individual, which is critical from the point of view of developing really new and innovative ideas. And I think organisations tend to send out mixed messages to their staff. On the one hand, you're highly trusted and empowered. On the other hand, you're scrutinised, observed and measured to death. And this goes back to apparently fairly innocuous things like, for example, most performance appraisal systems, this annual horrible meeting between managers and staff to review their progress over the previous year.
Evidence performance.
Yes, and there is absolutely no evidence that these systems generate improved organisational performance. But there's a lot of evidence that they demotivate people, both the managers who have to administer it and the people at the receiving end.
Yeah.
So why do we do it? Why do we do it? We do it because it generates the illusion of control, the illusion of insight and knowledge. But hardly anybody goes into an appraisal interview saying, I am going to tell my manager all of the problems that I have faced in the past year, the various mistakes that I have made and that I have observed. I'm going to go in and tell that manager how this organisation's systems are preventing us achieving our goals. Instead, you go into the appraisal interview to put your best foot forward. That does not help organisational learning, actually, if you think about it.
It's not reflective at all. Not honest and open things.
Not honest.
It's all about used as a way of like almost defending your position and then producing evidence that merits a promotion and or kind of like a pay rise.
And that's the worst of all worlds when performance appraisal is linked into performance related pay, as it very often is. I remember when I was at another university, University of Kent, I got on well with the HR director, and she brought me in one day to talk to the entire staff of the HR department about this issue. So at one point I said to them, and I think there was about 30 people there, I said, I want any of you to give me one tiny piece of evidence that you have about how our appraisal system has improved this organisation's performance in recent years. And there was a long silence, and then one individual at the back put his hand up and he said, but we need a paper trail in case we ever have to fire someone. That was the only defence of the system.
So that's not performance improving.
No, it's not. It's and yet a lot of it actually does boil down to that kind of technocratic mindset. So I think this type of control is perhaps an illusion, although technology is increasingly making it possible. But as we have discussed, the more you extend that technological surveillance, the more problems we will have. And human beings are very adept at trying to sabotage these systems, to work around them in one way or another, to create the illusion of compliance, particularly when it's involved in creative industries.
Yeah.
So we need to be very careful of what we wish for.
And does that feel like then there's a challenge coming up in the future with organisations?
It's here now, actually.
Do you think the reckoning is here? Kind of like now you have to really be clear about what you want to, what sort of leadership you are, what sort of organisation, kind of like what sort of leader you are, what sort of organisation you want to kind of like to operate, sort of to run, and then set the system conditions in many ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, a very interesting book was published a year or two ago called Surveillance Capitalism.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah, and which it's too long. That's the problem with it. In which the author, I don't know how to pronounce her name, argued that essentially we have moved to a position where organisations are commodifying the data of its customers. Organisations obviously like Amazon and Google and so on, and then using that data to market products, to make money from it, essentially. But we have surveillance capitalism now, I think, within organisations, and that is a little bit less explored. And yet, if you stick with the Amazon example, they can monitor what people do in absolutely fine detail.
Yeah.
And this is becoming, I think, quite pervasive now in certain industries, and it's leading to a climate, really there's no other way to put this other than the ruthless exploitation of people, these people who are supposedly our most important asset. And ultimately, what is the rationale for that? The rationale is that the only real purpose of an organisation is to improve shareholder value.
Yeah.
That's kind of like a soulless perspective. And there have been hundreds of studies over the years into motivation. Not one has ever found an employee who leaps out of bed in the morning and says, great, I'm off to improve shareholder value today. People are not motivated by that. They're motivated by other things. And we need, therefore, I think, a different approach to this. If there is room for optimism here, I think that optimism is that we're also in a climate now where it is possible for young, lean, mean organisations of a different scale to begin to start doing things and do things in a different way. And we should look to them for lessons. I've run across a delicatessen firm in Canada recently, which is at least claims to be modelled on anarchist principles.
Oh, you mean Zingerman's?
Zingerman's, huge attention.
Ann Arbor, actually, in the United States. And I had the chance to speak to Ari Weinswig, who is one of the founders over there. There are some tremendous organisations doing some very, very interesting kind of things,
and also not just new organisations like that, but I'm very struck by the changes in thinking within the military, for example. This mission command style of leadership. There are interesting people doing interesting work in these environments that are very different to the common sense assumptions we have about what they should be doing and why are they doing it. They're doing it because there are more and more problems with the old models that are evident.
I think so, and I think that I'm just in the process of writing a bit of a piece around which, by the time this comes out, it will have probably been published already, but around the sort of the nature. We talk about my area of focus is about service and experience and stuff, and the nature of experience a lot of the time gets, when you go to talk to organisations, and they'll talk about touch points and channels and journeys and all these different things, and they sort of get stuck in that. Someone's like a very kind of like mechanistic way of thinking about it, and then there's other organizations that just think about it in a completely different way. And everything from Dan Price and Gravity Payments across in Seattle, who read a Daniel Kahneman paper that talked about the marginal returns of kind of money in terms of contribution to happiness, and ended up kind of from 2015 put all of these kind of employees on a minimum of 70 grand a year.
Yes, I know that.
And just to take away all of their money worries, and then you bring your whole self to work. So, and how that impacts on the employee experience and then the customer experience and their overall growth and everything else, and they're doing really, really well. And there's a sock company in New York called Bombas, and their inspiration was around that the number one requested piece of clothing in homeless shelters is clean socks. And so they decided they were going to become a sock company or a clothing company, and they started with socks and then they moved on to t-shirts and things. But for every pair of socks that they sell, they give a pair into the homeless community. So they want to try and solve that and highlight that kind of that problem. And that just drives this kind of level of engagement around with their people because they're on a mission to do something. And then that kind of like spills over into the customers. So I just think you're absolutely right. There's examples of people just doing some cool and crazy things that we should be trying kind of learn from, because many of the big organisations are not necessarily the ones where some of the most kind of interesting, creative and probably useful and longer term stuff is actually happening.
So here's the challenge as I see it. Why don't we all do it and do it more? Because much of this stuff has been known for decades. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to these questions.
Yeah.
I think the biggest obstacle in recent decades has been that the growth of this mantra about the importance of shareholder value has focused the minds of top management teams only on that issue.
Yeah.
And we're all complicit in that, because those of us lucky enough to have salaried employment are in pension schemes, for example, and they want good returns all the time and short-term returns. So that creates an institutional barrier to thinking about the longer term. So we need to find creative, constructive ways of changing that, which means action at different levels. It means actions within corporations. It means actions from government.
You should check it out if you're not familiar with it. Have you heard of a guy called Eric Ries? Wrote a book called The Lean Startup.
That rings a bell.
Right. So he's got a new project on the go right now. It's called the Long-Term Stock Exchange.
Oh, wonderful.
Based out of California. It's been a thing, a nascent idea that's getting developed and getting increasing amounts of backing and stuff. You should check it out, because it's trying to change the dynamic around the quarterly reporting and that shareholder return to focus people on the longer term returns from investing in companies like with a mission or have like a longer view of the world. So there's things kind of happening, but the problem is they've got to they've got a long way to go if they're going to challenge the establishment.
Yeah. Well, we're on a journey that we have to take, so to speak, to move in that direction. But there's no point denying that there are fundamental barriers in the way, and it is not easy, and it will be very difficult to effect a deep-rooted change in our current models of capitalism and how organisations should function.
Well, I thought there's an interesting parallel with there was Joaquin Phoenix was at the BAFTAs the other day and made a speech around inequality and discrimination and things, and he said a really interesting thing. He says we should always keep advocating. Everybody should be advocating for the rights of the displaced, the disenfranchised, those that are discriminated against. He says, but the real change will only happen when those that built the system change the system themselves.
And if this isn't done in the medium to long term, you're looking at some form of social collapse.
Or it will consume it, as was it Marx said, kind of capitalism ends up eating itself.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So, thank you for all of that. If I said to you, somebody's listening to this and they want to become a better kind of leader in themselves, what would be your best advice?
Wow.
I mean, it's a quick fire thing. It's like, because you know how people kind of listen to this and be like, oh, that's really interesting. So, yeah, but what do I do with it?
Well, I would say, for example, I mentioned earlier this idea of people reducing the number of decisions that they make in a day. That would be one thing. Maybe also another thing associated with that would be, how many times in the day do you ask somebody a question about your own performance?
Right.
On something that is either significant or not, as the case might be, just to get started down that road. How many times a day do you get away from official channels and just interact with people at the coalface of the organisation to see the world through their eyes, become like an anthropologist, so to speak?
Yeah.
Because the one thing that strikes you, and I used to do quite a lot of consulting on companies, is that the only people who would ever be surprised by the problems you identify were the top team. Everybody else knew it already. So we can cut out the consultants, me and others like me, and just actually get people to get down from their high chairs and talk to people a lot more at the coalface about what is going on.
I like that idea of being an anthropologist of your own organisation.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a new discipline in the making, kind of organisational anthropology.
Organisational anthropology, yeah, I think so. I was listening to an interesting talk by a former British diplomat on this subject the other day, where he was talking about how you can use the skills of diplomacy. And he said when you're just new in the job, it's great, you can ask idiot questions. And nobody takes offence or minds. They tell you what they really think. Well, maybe we need to do that as managers and organisations as well. Get rid of this idea that I already should know all the answers. Just ask more bloody questions.
Yeah, no, indeed.
About what is going on.
So before I wrap up, the final kind of like thing that I've been doing at the end of these interviews is because it's related to a book that I recently published last year, was called Punk CX, which I've shown you, and given that you're from Northern Ireland, steeped in a history of kind of good punk. I've been asking. I'm looking forward to this. I've been asking people for two things. So that's a piece of like ongoing kind of social research. And I said, if I was to ask you to describe one word that would describe sort of a punk approach to, I don't know, leadership and kind of organizational design or structure or whatever, what would it be?
The one word.
One word.
I would say, well, can I have two?
Okay, two. I'll give you two.
Embrace ignorance.
Okay.
Embrace uncertainty. Embrace ignorance in the sense that you really do not really know what's going on around you, and if you think you do, you're probably wrong. It's like what I always say to people about Northern Ireland politics: if they think they understand it, it means they're confused. You can't do that. So just embrace ignorance and be willing to admit that you don't know. But other people probably have more of the answer than you do, especially when you're new in the job. This pretense that you go into the job and you already can figure everything out is very harmful.
Sure.
I think. So embrace ignorance, which opens the space to make mistakes. celebrate mistakes like the early punk rockers did. They weren't renowned for the brilliance of their musicianship. But those mistakes were improvisations, and they were something new, and they were radical, and they were revolutionary. And it meant that established ideas weren't taken for granted anymore. And I still am appalled when I meet young students by how, even before how they start, they just are into the hierarchical model that they have become used to, and they think that it's natural. It isn't natural, it isn't effective, it isn't the blueprint for an effective approach in the future. And I think, punk, let's do something different.
And then if I was to ask you, is there one organisation that you think embodies that sort of punk kind of ethos that springs to mind?
I think there are many organisations that embody part of it, but in truth probably very few big ones that have it all off. Many of us know about places like Semco in Brazil, where they have a radically different approach, and I don't think I need to go into it.
No.
And there are, units of the military that are trying a kind of different approach. And I had a student come up to me the other day after a workshop, and she said, I know an organisation in Brighton that is trying to do some of the things that you talk about. And it's called the Big Lemon.
Right. The bus company,
A bus company which is into green energy and various other things. I don't know anything about it, but I think that there's probably loads of little organisations around there where the individuals who have founded them are not just thinking about share value or profit. They're thinking about that, of course, but they're also thinking they want to do some good in the world.
About impact.
And impact, and social impact, and sustainability. And we can learn a lot from them.
Perfect. Dennis, it's been an absolute pleasure.
It has for me too.
Thanks
you.
very much.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.